President, I yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. A compromise has been reached on the Farm Bill. The measure announced by House and Senate Agriculture Committees preserves food stamp benefits for most Americans who receive them and continues subsidies for farmers. The compromise was expected to cut food stamps by about $800 million a year, or around 1%. A smaller cut than what was approved by the House in September, which sought to cut 5% from the program. The House could vote on this compromise bill as soon as Wednesday. A short time ago, the Senate voted to move forward with the bill that makes changes to the National Flood Insurance Program. Senator Bill Nelson was on the Senate floor earlier talking about the bill.
Ask consent the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
And consent to speak in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, last Friday at Rockefeller Chapel on the campus of the University of Chicago, hundreds braved the frigid weather to pay tribute to a fallen American hero. The life story of John Rogers, Jr. recalls an extraordinary chapter in the history of our nation. 70 years ago, during World War II, the first African-American military aviators in the history of the United States Armed Forces deployed to North Africa. These brave men were part of the now legendary 99th Pursuit Squadron of the United States Army Air Corps. We know them better today as the very first Tuskegee Airmen. to be deployed overseas, the first of the first. During the war, these Tuskegee Airmen were often referred to as red tails after the distinctive color of their aircraft that they flew. Many of the bomber crews whose missions the Tuskegee Airmen escorted over Nazi-occupied Europe and other places had another name for them. They called them the red-tailed angels because they made it possible for so many other pilots to come home after the war to their families. Last Tuesday, one of those original red-tailed angels went to his final home. I'm proud to say that I knew him and I know his family. His name was Judge John Rogers. He lived to be 95 years old, and he lived most of his adult life in the city of Chicago. These are some photos of him. Let me tell you about him. John Rogers was born in Knoxville, Tennessee in 1918. His father was a minister who owned a 12-chair barbershop. His mother died of tuberculosis when John was 4 years old. The family lived across the street from Knoxville College, where John's parents had both attended. Their father instilled in John and his three sisters a reverence for education. In addition to learning, young John Rogers also developed a love of flying. These were years when flying was still a new miracle. As a boy, Judge Rogers would construct his own model planes using paper, string, and light wood from the cheese boxes. When he was 9 or 10 years old, he walked miles from his family's home to the Knoxville airport just to be able to say he'd touched an airplane. When he was 12 years old, this young man suffered another terrible loss. His father died of kidney failure. John and his three sisters moved to Chicago to live with his mother's brother, a kind man who raised them in a loving home. Judge Rogers attended Tilden Technical High School in Chicago, walking 4 miles each way to school, 8 miles a day. After high school, he earned a degree from the Chicago Teachers College, put himself through college working as a short-order cook, among other jobs. After college, he became a teacher in the Chicago Public Schools. But while he was studying to be a teacher, he was also learning to fly in the Army's civilian pilot training program in Chicago, where all the instructors were black. He received his civilian pilot's license in 1938 at the age of 20, one of only 120 African-American pilots in the whole country at that time. When World War II broke out, John Rogers tried to enlist in the Army as a pilot. The Army told him that they just didn't have any place for colored pilots and didn't have any plans to have any colored pilots. But they had an opening for a truck driver. John Rogers said, no thanks. He said he figured if he was going to be in combat, it was safer to be in the air than on the ground. So he volunteered in 1941 for a new Army Air Corps training program that had just been established for African-American pilots in Tuskegee, Alabama. He became part of the 99th Pursuit Squadron, the first all-black air unit under the leadership of the legendary Lieutenant Colonel, later General, Benjamin O. Davis. In April 1943, John Rogers was one of the first 28 African-American pilots to go overseas. The 99th was based in North Africa and flew escort and bombing missions over Sicily and Italy. Pilots of the 99th once set a record for destroying 5 enemy aircraft in under 4 minutes. Even among such an elite group of pilots, John Rogers stood out for keen eyesight, steady nerves. Mark Hansen's the curator of the Chanute Air Museum, formerly Chanute Air Force Base, in Rantoul, Illinois, where the 99th was first activated. He said John Rogers was respected as a pilot who was so good he could, quote, put a 500-pound bomb through a building's window. A photo at the Chanute Museum taken by an armaments officer and friend shows John Rogers standing next to his P-40 Warhawk. An inscription on the photo reads, "This is Jack Rogers, the best dive bomber pilot in the business." Another photo of John Rogers and members of the 99th hangs at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. The skill of the men of the 99th was well known among pilots, especially by the British, who often asked for the airmen's close air support. Mr. President, what I'm about to say here I read as I sat at that church service. I looked at it and said it must be a misprint. And I read it again, and it's true. All told, John Rogers flew 120 often dangerous combat missions for his nation over Europe, most of it over Nazi-occupied territory, and he rose to the rank of Army captain. 120 missions. After the war, he returned to Chicago. He decided at that time he wanted to go to law school. So he said, I'm going to the best. He applied over the phone at the University of Chicago Law School. He was told that he lacked, quote, the necessary qualifications, close quote. Undeterred, John Rogers showed up the next day at the law school wearing his Army officer's uniform. He said that someone who had served his country in war deserved a chance to at least take a test to prove that he did have the qualifications to go to law school. So they gave him a test, and he passed it, and he attended law school under the GI Bill. He went to school year-round, summers too, and graduated ahead of his class in 1948. He also, over time, earned a Ph.D. from Ohio State University. On his first day in law school, John Rogers met his future wife, Jewel Stratford, who would go on to become the first African-American woman to graduate from the University of Chicago Law School. She later served in the administration of 2 presidents. John and Jewel Rogers had one son, John Jr., and although they divorced after 15 years of marriage, they remained close friends until her death many years later, and they both were actively engaged in raising an extraordinary son who is my friend today. Judge Rogers practiced law in Chicago for almost 30 years. He gained a reputation as an outstanding attorney, committed to justice and to his clients, and to mentoring and supporting younger, talented African-American lawyers. In 1968, on a blind date, he met a fellow University of Chicago graduate, an educator who was active with the NAACP Education Fund. John Rogers and Gwen DuBose dated for 33 years before marrying in 2001. They were a good match. They were devoted to one another. In May 1977, John Rogers was appointed an associate judge in Cook County. Several months later, assigned to the juvenile division. Now, some judges don't like the juvenile court and look for a transfer. The cases can be heartbreaking, and the proceedings occur out of the public view, so juvenile court judges don't receive publicity that some of their colleagues receive. John Rogers loved juvenile court. He spent 21 years as a judge there and eventually became the supervising judge. To the often complicated cases involving minors, Judge Rogers strove to bring wisdom, compassion, and justice. Gwen Rogers has a stack of letters from men and women who appeared before Judge Rogers as youth and later wrote him letters thanking him for giving them a second chance. There was one letter in particular that he kept close and read several times. It was from a man who appeared before Judge Rogers 3 different occasions. On his 3rd court appearance, Judge Rogers said, I could send you to juvenile detention and you would deserve it, but I still see a glimmer of hope in you. Instead, I'm going to send you to Boys Town. He made it clear to the young man this was his last chance. Years later, that boy, now a grown man, wrote to him and said that he finished at Boys Town, went on to graduate from college, became a minister, and founded a church in your home state of Indiana. Judge Rogers was a sort of man who really became a father to many young men who needed someone to look up to. The young man he really poured his hopes and dreams into was his own son, John Rogers, Jr. When John Jr. was 12 years old, his parents invested in some stock for him. Every birthday and Christmas after that, instead of toys, John Jr. received stock certificates. At the age of 16, he got his first summer job. That was a family rule. Judge Rogers saved every dime he could in order to send his son to the best school. Eventually, John Rogers Jr. graduated from Princeton University. He would go on to found Ariel Capital Management, now called Ariel Investments, the first African-American-owned asset management company in America. Mr. President, in 2007, the Tuskegee Airmen were honored right here in the United States Capitol with the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor our nation can bestow. The Tuskegee Airmen are the largest group ever to receive the medal. About 300 of the airmen crowded into the Capitol Rotunda on that cold March day to receive their medals. What an incredible sight. Many wore red jackets, a symbol of their red-tailed angel's reputation. Afterwards, I was honored to host a reception in my Capitol office for the 11 Tuskegee Airmen from my home state of Illinois. One of them was John Rogers. Also joining us for that little reception was my colleague at the time, Senator Barack Obama. What a great moment that was to see the arc of history and justice. 5 years later, President Barack Obama invited Judge Rogers and 14 other surviving Tuskegee Airmen to the White House for a special screening of Red Tails, that George Lucas film about those historic flyers. Talk about the arc of history. The first African-American president inviting the first African-American aviators to the White House. Judge Rogers, this man whose courage helped to break the color barrier in America's military, first knew Barack Obama as a promising young community organizer who was dating Michelle Robinson. The Rogers and Robinson families go back a long, long way. When John Rogers, Jr. was captain of Princeton's basketball team, he recruited Craig Robinson, Michelle's brother, to play for Princeton. Craig Robinson would later help persuade his younger sister to attend Princeton. And there they were, all those years later, Judge Rogers, President and Mrs. Obama together in the White House, watching a Hollywood film about the Tuskegee Airmen. Judge Rogers' granddaughter, Victoria, said that her grandfather actually watched the film 3 different times. Every time he's moved his hands like he was flying. She said, quote, he said he could remember the tension. A while back, Judge Rogers told a reporter, I hope there are planes in heaven so I can fly, because you know how much I love to fly. Well, Judge, I hope there are planes there too for your sake, and I hope you're sitting in first class or in the cockpit where you belong. You earned it. In closing, Loretta and I, our family, want to extend our sincere condolences again to Judge Rogers, his beloved wife Gwen, his son John Jr., his granddaughter Victoria, to the rest of the Rogers family, to Judge Rogers' many friends, and all of those whose lives he touched and enriched. That gathering in that Rockefeller chapel was such an outstanding turnout of people in Chicago who wanted to pay tribute to the great man, John Rogers, Sr. He will be dearly missed. Mr. President, I yield the floor. I ask
The Assistant Majority Leader.
Ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 295 S1901.
The clerk will report.
Calendar number 295 S1901, a bill to authorize the President to extend the term of the nuclear energy agreement with the Republic of Korea until March 19, 2016.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
I further ask the bill be read a third time and passed. The motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the consideration of H. Con. Res. 75, which was received from the House and is at the desk.
The clerk will report.
H. Con. Res. 75, providing for a joint session of Congress to receive a message from the President.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
I ask unanimous consent the concurrent resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and the motions to reconsider be laid upon the table.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of Senate Resolution 337 submitted earlier today.
The clerk will report.
S-Res. 337, expressing support for the designation of January 28, 2014 as National Data Privacy Day.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
I further ask the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the consideration of Senate Resolution 338 submitted earlier today.
The clerk will report.
S-Res 338, designating Diane K. Scarvala as Curator Emeritus of the United States Senate.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, the motion to reconsider be laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I understand that Senate Bill 1963, introduced earlier today by Senator Pryor, is at the desk. I ask for its first reading.
The clerk will read the title of the bill for the first time.
The clerk will read the title of the bill for the first time.
S. 1963, a bill to repeal Section 403 of the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2013.
I now ask for a second reading and I object to my own request.
Objection is heard.
Objection is heard.
The bill will be read for a second time on the next legislative day.
The bill will be read for a second time on the next legislative day.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it adjourn until 10 a.m. on Tuesday, January 28, 2014, that following the prayer and pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, and the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, that following any leader remarks, the Senate resume consideration of the motion to proceed to S. 1926, the flood insurance bill post-cloture, that the Senate recess from 12:30 p.m. until 2:15 p.m. to allow for the weekly caucus meetings. Finally, I ask the time during the adjournment and recess count post-closure.
Without objection.
Mr. President, the President of the United States will deliver the State of the Union address at 9 p.m. tomorrow. All senators are invited to the joint session. The Senate will begin gathering in the Senate chamber at 8:20 p.m., depart for the Senate chamber at 8:30 p.m. to proceed as a body to the Hall of the House. And if there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it adjourn under the previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.
The Senate stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.
The Senate today voted to move forward with legislation that would delay scheduled increases in federal flood insurance rates. Also this week, the Senate could take up the final version of the Farm Bill. Earlier